Good afternoon, everybody. A big welcome to our July gathering. We're here to celebrate the launch of Bill Slate's book, The Wartime Diary of Dorothea Burnett, and a particular welcome to Dorothea's niece, Dorothy Radford, her two brothers, Bruce and Peter, one wife, Joy, and friend, Errol. We're very glad to have you with us. Welcome. Now, all this started about 20-odd years ago when Dr. Dorothy donated a big box of gear from Dorothea, her aunt. And when the VHS people at the time looked at it, they were absolutely stunned. It was like a treasure trove. It was full of photographs and letters that Dorothea had written during the war, letters written to Dorothea during the war, documents. It was wonderful. And it has sat there beautifully kept in acid-free containers and papers, of course, but nothing being done with it until the right person came along, and the right person has now come along, Bill Laverack, who has put it all together in a book. And Bill's going to talk to us about putting the book together, and then Dorothy is going to give us a visual look at her bits and pieces. You right, Bill?
Holds out for this. I think first of all, I think Wilma called it my book, but it's not really my book. It's definitely Dorothea's book. And Wilma herself, plus Jess Harris, had a lot to do with putting this book together. They transcribed all the pages of Dorothea's handwriting. It wasn't too bad a handwriting, I might add. And the actual diary is out the front here. You can all have a look at it later. Initially, I was a little bit not too keen on doing it. I've never tried to edit someone else's writing before, and I wasn't really wrapped in it. But as I slowly got into reading her diary, I became more and more involved, till the point came where I think, I really got to know Dorothea really quite well, and almost to the point where I could call her Da, as some people will know what that means. Well, the book that's available today consists of the actual diary, and the diary was from the 21st of September 1940 to the 15th of May 1941. And I've supplemented that with extracts from letters. There's a lot of letters, I haven't counted them, lots and lots of letters that she wrote back to the family and the family wrote to her. Unfortunately, the letters don't have a lot of historical interest. They're mostly asking for a warm pair of pyjamas to wear when she was in Eritrea, or for family gossip, how's my horse Trixie doing, and this sort of thing. So there wasn't a great deal in there, but wherever I could find something that either told about the war or told about her surroundings, I included an extract from that. The other thing Dorothea did was, when she lobbed in Gaza in early 1940, she bought it. One of the first things she did was buy a camera, and she took a large number of photographs, and some of them, and this is only some of them I might add in these albums, are on display here. You can have a look at them. Again, the photographs, a lot of them just a group of nurses standing in front of a building, which are not that interesting, especially if the nurses aren't named. But some of them are, really of top interest. Well, an interesting thing that happened was, while I was sorting through this, I was also looking through some photographs my father, who was in the Air Force during the war, had taken. And he was a flight lieutenant based on HMAS Canberra, escorting ships from Perth across to Colombo and to India. Just so happens he was on the convoy that escorted Dorothea's ship. So I took a couple of photos out of his photos too and put them in there of the ships in the convoy. After the Middle East, Dorothea went to New Guinea, and it's a pity really she didn't keep the diary going in New Guinea, but we've got a few bits and pieces from her letters, and she did write quite an extensive account of setting up an operating theatre in New Guinea and again in Wartime. And this was a case where they were setting up an operating theatre, dealing with a lot of wounded soldiers in New Guinea, and in a difficult climate and a place where not everything was available. You had to improvise, and she did a marvellous job in that, because by the time she got to New Guinea she was a very experienced nurse. And that's one of the things you'll see if you read through the diary. She changes from a shy, naive country girl, which she was when she left Buderim, to really being very competent and very confident. And she got, as I say, mentioned in dispatches for the work she did in New Guinea. Apart from the interesting history that's in the diary, there are some, it's full of interesting little sidelights, interesting little bits. I love the bit where she just boarded the Aquitaine before it sailed from Sydney, and she says they were having a dinner. I think the Governor-General was attending the dinner. She says, "We're all dressed up in our mess frocks for dinner." And then she's written after that and underlined it in capital letters, "a bit of rot." She wasn't greatly impressed with these sort of functions, apparently. Then it goes on a bit further. She says, now, you've got to remember Dorothea was a country girl. She was a very strong Methodist family, and I suspect someone had given her a couple of glasses of champagne at this dinner. And she says, "Disgraced myself, felt giddy and had to retire to the capital." I guess the heart of the diary, though, is the serious bit, the really interesting bit is the bit about Greece. The AIF was in Greece, and I think it was from what I can gather, it was a badly planned and probably a mistake to invade Greece in any case, because the Germans very rapidly kicked them out. And the diary goes in quite a bit of detail. They'd set up a hospital at a place called Ikali, just a bit out of Athens, I think. And the Germans were advancing. There was a lot of wounded soldiers there. Some were mobile, but most of them weren't. And they were asked, the nurses were asked who would volunteer to stay behind with the soldiers. The likely consequence of staying behind and looking after them was that they would be captured by the Germans, although they thought that this was not going to be, well, too serious, in that the Germans would probably allow them to continue working as nurses, looking after both Allied and German soldiers. So Dorothea was one of the group that volunteered. In fact, I think they all volunteered, but 39 were picked out to stay behind. Dorothea was one of them. And most of the nurses left, but just before, really very close to when the Germans would have arrived, General Blamey, who was the commanding officer, said that he wanted all the nurses out of there. So Dorothea was evacuated along with the other 38 in a big hurry. They had to travel in lorries during the night and then hide during the day to get to the port. At this time, one of the saddest notes, I think, in the diary is that Colonel Kay, who was the commanding officer of the 2nd 5th Australian General Hospital, was killed. He was on the docks boarding a ship or waiting to board or something, and he was killed by German bombs. And he must have been quite a person, I think, Colonel Kay. Someone should write a book about him if they haven't already, because he went through Gallipoli as a medical officer, all through the Western Front. He earned a DSO, and then stayed in the militia during the war, and then rolled up again in the Second World War. Really, that's about all I want to say about it. I think at this stage I'll hand over to Dorothy, who's going to tell us about that.
Hello. I thought I'd do it with pictures because we've got a lot of pictures and the visual impact and so on, I think, is worthwhile. The Buderim Historical Society has done so well in preserving all this information and also all this knowledge, and I'm sure that a lot of people here probably know as much or more of the history than I do, so you can certainly correct me. But there's just a sequence of things I'd like to start with, and I'm going to start with our great-great-grandparents, John and Jane Burnett left England with their 9 sons and 1 daughter, and they were on the sailing ship Eastern Empire, which arrived in Queensland in 1866. And the Historical Society here has a copy of that diary, and it's really very interesting to read about all the storms, the doldrums, the children getting sick, and the long, long time it took to get to Queensland. But eventually they arrived, and several of the sons eventually moved to Buderim. I found the passenger list of Eastern Empire for 1866. So John and Jane Burnett were there, and their 9 sons and 1 daughter listed, and they came out with Anne North, who eventually married the first son, John Burnett. Pioneer Cottage, and that's one of the early pictures of the house, which is this one here. You can see where they've cut down the trees, and that was the original home, with the woman Anne North, who came out to help look after a lot of the kids on the way. Obviously, they had a big family too. There were 9 children. You can also see they had 2 dogs and a bike. And you can see the veranda, but not much garden, and there were slats on the roof at that stage. John worked at the Buderim sugar mill. He'd already worked down south on the sugar mill, and you can see the house up here, and you can also see the cane train, and that was another picture of the cane train at Buderim. And some of the other Burnett boys worked in the timber mill. This is John Burnett at home in Buderim in 1909, seated on the ground, and his wife by that stage had died. In Lutwich Cemetery in Brisbane, I found the mark. John Curl died in 1921, and he's buried in Lutwich Cemetery. Apparently the funeral service was held in the front room here, and the body was taken to Brisbane. So then comes our great-grandparents. Edward Lionel Burnett, or Lionel, was the 3rd son or the 4th child, and he married Isabella Doretta Lowe, or called Etta, and they lived in Pioneer Cottage here with the great-grandfather. And Lionel was apprenticed as a saddler, and you've also got the record of his contract to be an apprentice, a saddler. And to be an apprentice saddler in those days, they had to sign on for 5 years. They were not to frequent pubs or gaming houses or places of ill repute. They were to behave themselves very, very well, and it's all documented in the museum there. That's my grandparents' wedding invitation, and their first child was Dorothea Ann Burnett, and that's what the book is about, and that's where we're getting. And she was born on the 19th of October 1914, and there are pictures of her when she was about 3. And we used 5 years later, Bruce and Peter and my mother was born. She was 5 years younger. She couldn't pronounce the name Dorothea, and so forever after, Dorothea was known as Da, and of course we called her Auntie Da. The nurses called her Dottie. So they lived in the cottage. My grandfather had a car for hire, as well as doing saddling work and fruit growing, and you can see his old card, telephone Buderim number 11, and he used to do some driving around in the car. That's him in later years in his work clothes up here on Buderim. Our grandmother, Etta, is on the front steps of the house there. A lot of bushes at that stage. The girls went to Buderim State School. Dar on the left there, Joyce on the right. And another picture from Buderim State School. And they used to go down to Mooloolaba, and they had a boat down there. Dorothea and Joyce used to get fed up with their mother when she'd go down in a sulky, because she'd keep stopping on the way down to talk to people. But the kids wanted to get down there. After they'd finished school, Dar came home here, and she had her horse Trixie, and she used to ride all around. She'd ride down to Caloundra or over to Mullaney, and she was having a happy time. But her mother suggested that she might need a job, and she eventually became a nurse. And she trained at the Brisbane General Hospital and lived in there and got to know many of the people who went off in the army with her. My mother became a school teacher and married another school teacher, John Bradford, my father. And so Dar went off to war as an army nurse, which we'll hear a bit more about. Dad also went off to war, and so Mum came home to Buderim to stay with her mother and father at that time. That's my mum on a horse, and you can see she's not a competent horsewoman like Dar was. She's just sitting there. That's the cottage in those early years, and I was born while they were away at war. Doting grandparents, and of course lots and lots of pictures because I was the first grandchild. Dad came home from the christening. They said I screamed all through. Dad came home from leave, and that was me at the back, and Dad brought a gollywog. In those days it was quite okay to have a gollywog, particularly when he'd made it in New Guinea. Apparently the little rooms upstairs in the cottage, in the Pioneer Cottage, there's a door that I couldn't get open, and apparently when Dad was home I told the door what I thought of it in language that he only heard in the army. It said that I'd picked that up down the road somewhere. And of course that's Dar again home on leave with me. Now the story in the book is about Dar's war years. She went off on the Aquitania. That's her war medals, or her dog tags. And they went by ship from Sydney to Perth to Bombay, up the Suez Canal, and they ended up in Gaza there. And initially they were setting up the 2nd, 5th Australian General Hospital in Gaza, but they seemed to have a bit of spare time. So the nurses set up camp, but then they went off on happy things. She was riding a donkey there, but obviously found a horse to ride along the beach at Gaza. They visited Jerusalem, and she was obviously pretty impressed with Jerusalem. She bought a camera, and they, all the nurses, very well dressed, went around and saw all the sights there. And then they moved to set up the hospital a little further north at Rehoboth. This was in the Australian Women's Weekly, with all the nurses lined up at Rehoboth in the tent camp. Dar I've arrowed there. And then they were on the move, and they were to move out of Palestine and go to Greece. And they had to wait a long, long time for a train, but eventually had to go through to Alexandria and then across to Greece, and they set up at what was a summer hotel, and the nurses had their quarters there, and they set up a hospital. And you've heard how the story, and it's beautifully told in the book. It's quite exciting how the nurses had to hide in a cemetery and move by night. the 39 nurses who were left, who were going to run the hospital, apparently were told at the last minute that they had to go. They just had to take a haversack, some water and some food and their tin hat. So they had to leave a lot of things behind, including clothing. So they got down to the wharf. They'd heard Colonel K had been killed by German bombing, and there was German bombing, and they got on a ship which was very heavily laden with soldiers, and the nurses shared cabins, and so they went to 2 berth cabins, and they had 8 nurses in those cabins, 2 in each bed and 4 on the floor. And there was bombing as they came across, so there was shrapnel, but I don't think anyone was actually killed on that ship. They then got on a truck in Crete, I think that's now the Sunglasses, and they had to spend some time in Crete before eventually going back to Gaza, to Palestine. Eventually the nurses shared clothes and managed to have a wash, went swimming in their undies and got out of the horrible war zone. The next was that they went to Eritrea, which is on the Red Sea, and this used to be Italian, but they set up camp up the mountains north of Asmara, and took over from an Italian airport and set up a hospital there. But that hospital wasn't all that busy, and again I think they had some spare time. And one town there that they visited was called Gura, and we'll mention that again because that name comes up. So the war in the Pacific then was getting important, and they were on their way back, and apparently the ships were going to go to Java. Then they heard about the fall of Singapore, and the ships were diverted and came through to Adelaide, and they went home from Adelaide for a while. The 2nd, 5th Australian General Hospital set up at Armidale. So back home, they went to Brisbane, and of course they went back. She spent a little bit of time on Buderim, and then they were all sent off to Bootless Bay at near Port Moresby, and set up a tent camp there, and eventually set up a more permanent camp. And they had a lot of prisoners of war and war injuries from the Pacific. Dar was in charge of the operating theatres by that time. You've heard how she had to improvise. The hospital ship Centaur, as you know, was sunk off Moreton Island, and it was actually off on its way up to Papua New Guinea, to Bootless Bay, and it would have been bringing people back, wounded soldiers back here. And of course there were nurses and doctors on board. She knew some of the nurses on board who were coming up, and of course so many were killed. There weren't too many survivors, and posters subsequently used to say, "Avenge the nurses from the Centaur." And then eventually, towards the end of the war, the 2nd, 5th 88 set up at Morotai, which you see is just above the equator. It's in Indonesia, and once again they started off with a tent hospital, and Dar was in charge of the theatres. It was at Morotai that they heard about the bombing in Japan, and eventually some of the prisoners of war came to Morotai in a very bad condition, and they were nursed to go back, to try to get them back to health. Eventually, when she returned to Australia, she was sent to Stewart Home, which was a convent, and it was a very secretive business because the very ill, wasted soldiers were brought there to be nursed back to health. some of them were Brisbane boys, and although it was all secret and they were being nursed back to health, they used to nick out at night and go home. But for Da's work in theatres, she was given an MID, a mentioned in dispatches. I never knew about this until I was getting ready for her funeral, and somebody told me I should put MID down. She'd never told me about it. Anyway, she came home to Buderim. Her horse Trixie was there. There's the old bakehouse, her father, and she called her the foal Gura, Trixie's offspring. She then eventually went and worked at the Greenslopes Repatriation Hospital, and in 1946 it was time to leave Buderim, and our family moved to Manly Road, Manly. My brother Bruce was born in 46 and Peter in 47, and we took Grandpa Burnett to Manly Road, Manly, and the horse Gura. It bucked me off one time, but I wasn't much of a horse person either. Da bought a Fiat. Never in the rest of her life would she touch a Japanese car. She bought a Fiat. She'd come down most weekends from Greenslopes. We as kids were spoilt and taken hither and yon. That was down at Wellington Point. And as you are well aware, eventually in 1952 the 20 acres up here was subdivided. We came up for the property sale, and my two brothers used to have to go to the edge of the markings and stand there while they were doing the auctions. And Sybil Vise bought the house, and she was part of the Brisbane Buderim Historical Society, as I'm sure you are well aware, and she donated the house and was very much involved in the history of the society. Da eventually went to Melbourne and was in the Repatriation General Hospital at Heidelberg, where she was in charge of the theatres. She became a fellow of the Australian College of Nursing. She retired to Southport with the ex-matron of Heidelberg, and she did various trips, and she used to do a lot of dog sitting when we went away. She went to family events. This is up at Mount Glorious with Bunyanuts, and she met her grandnephew and grandniece at Southport. Bruce and Joy used to go down for holidays and meet up with her. She was thrilled when the Greek government gave her an award. I can't read that, but she used to have it up on her wall because she was proud of it, and she actually went to the Greek club with my mum and dad to have it presented. I brought her up here one time. We did have the dogs with her, but she quite enjoyed coming back to the old home. And she died in 1991 and is buried at Southport. Now, being a retiring, self-effacing person, she would always highlight other people but never herself. But she's mentioned in the book Proudly We Served, telling us the war stories. And as you know, Hessie Linsell from the Buderim Historical Society wrote a book of stories about Buderim, and particularly featuring Da, called Buderim Born. Joan Hogarth did a book, as you're aware, of Buderim and the society, and of course now we've got the Wartime Diary of Dorothea Burnett, and with lots of the war pictures with her diary and with the history. She would probably say, "What rot?" But I'm proud to have been her niece, and I enjoyed the diary, and it's really quite exciting to read, particularly a bit about Greece. Thank you very much.
I'll ask Mel William, our Vice President, to just say a few words.
Thanks very much for that, Dorothy. That was great. I really enjoyed that. It's really great to be able to put some life into a story like that. Well, we all know about Dorothea Burnett. There's that Greek presentation certificate is over there in Pioneer Cottage. I've been seeing it for years. But you brought it to life, which was really great. And isn't it fabulous that this is the only person here who's ever lived in this house? Unless, of course, Prue is actually living there. Like we all suspect. But look, thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed it. And we'd like you to take this back with you. This is Bill Labrak's other book, or one of his many books. It's his previous book, and it's stories of old Buderim.
Thank you very much.
He wrote most of them, I would think. This must have fallen out of it.
Oh, thank
And
you.
this is special. This is rosella jam. Rosellas were grown out here along the side wall, and I presume Prue made it. She usually does. And I've got some, so it's damn good. Thank you very, very much.
That was great. Are there any questions for Dorothy? Any questions? No? Okay. Well, I'd like to...
Matter of
sorry.
interest,
Yes.
quite a bit of that Greece stuff was in Weary Dunlop's book, because his movements were the same as hers pretty well in that early period. If you read that Weary Dunlop, I was surprised because I thought he was going to talk mainly about being in a prisoner of war, but the first about 100 pages was all about the war in Europe and in Gaza, and they apparently, the doctors and the nurses were moved, hospitals moved together, so that was very interesting. You know, you're commenting on clearly that was, and that evacuation was terrible from Greece. He gave it in pretty vivid detail.
Thank you. Anything else? No?
Where exactly was the bakehouse at Old Pioneer Cottage?
Well, as I understood it, I think it was just out the back here.
Was it?
Yes.
About where the slope hut is.
Yeah. There was the nut tree, the Queensland nut tree, and the bakehouse was near that. Because there was a photo of me at the age of 3 that I had learned to crack a nut at the bakehouse with a rock. So, yeah, out the back.
Oh, good, thanks.
Any other questions? Yes, Robin.
I'd like to just mention
Those books are for sale at the front door. Robin will take your money.
yes.
And I'd like to invite you all to stay and have a cup of tea and speak to Dorothy.